Welcome to the HR Uprising podcast. This podcast series explores HR hot topics and challenges through conversations with relevant experts and real-life HR, learning, and OD professionals. The HR Uprising is about learning through collaboration and evidence-based action. We want colleagues to have the confidence and skills to rise up through their organizations by delivering real, lasting business value. Now, introducing your host, chartered psychologist, experienced change agent, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach, Lucinda Carney.
Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda Carney from Actus, and this week is a solo episode, and the topic is going to be on imposter syndrome, or complex or phenomenon. We don't not worry too much about the second half of the title, but certainly this is something that has come up through conversations with our community. You know that very often I get the topics of the podcast from your feedback and from the community, and I thank you very much for that. Quick shout out to people who have given me extra information on this topic. Not least Sean Duddy, who works with us as our marketing expert. But also I got some really great input. Thank you for the HR Ninjas who took place in a poll that I'm going to share the results with this week. Also, Tom Blake sent some really great up-to-date information from British Psychological Society, Faye Ashton Wright and Nikki Hurst. So thanks to all of you contributors, and apologies if there were earlier contributors that I didn't manage to grab your names. Also, thanks to everybody who's been downloading and telling colleagues about downloading the HR Uprising podcast. We have now broken the 20,000 downloads, which is quite a momentous achievement, and I'm proud and really humbled by that. So thank you for that. And also thanks to you who've taken the time to link in with me or send me messages. I really appreciate those personal messages. It's great. And it really helps me motivate me when I'm trying to research something. And this was an example of it, because I thought I knew what imposter complex was, and actually I probably did, but I didn't realise how much information there was out there about it and how much it's still going forwards. And with that health warning in place, I would say that what I'm going to share with you today, as usual, I want to try and make it reasonably to the point and reasonably practical. So we'll look a little bit about what imposter syndrome is, but we'll also look at how we might recognise it in others and in ourselves, what we can do about it, where it's normal, and how we can help others. So it will be practical as ever. But the health warning is that there's still a lot of research in this area, and it's not completely evolved, if you like. And I'm not sure that's surprising, because quite a lot of it looks at gender differences. And given what's going on in the workplace, it's such a time of change, I believe, for gender, that there's no wonder these things are evolving too. So, imposter syndrome. Have you heard of it? Do you suffer from it? The reality is that most of us will and do at some point in our lives. Now, the first time I actually recognised myself experiencing imposter syndrome, although I'm pretty sure it wasn't the first time, was when I moved into my first standalone learning and development role. So I was in my late 20s, and I was in a new company, and I was in an expert, in inverted commas, role. I was sitting in this sales training meeting, and there were loads of senior managers there, and the MD of the business at the time turned to me without an ounce of sarcasm and said, "Let's find out what the training expert thinks we should do." Ever been called an expert? Well, I'll tell you what, it made me squirm at that term. And I spouted something which was fairly common sense as far as I was concerned, i.e. not at all expert. But the audience seemed happy with my response, and I was quite relieved that I hadn't been found out on that occasion. Now, I reflect on that objectively. It's interesting that I really did feel so excruciatingly uncomfortable. Yet I had spent 5 years previously in sales or sales training or training roles. I got a master's in psychology with a specific module on learning and development. And I had as much common sense as anyone else around that table, which actually notably was all men. Yet I still felt like an imposter. So I think it's something that is really normal for us to have, and yet objectively when I challenge that, it doesn't really make sense why we're having those feelings, when actually in that context there's every reason that we might be an expert. I've got other sort of social examples of that though. So I mean, in later life I was lucky enough to buy a fairly iconic house in the village that I live in, largely unfortunately because my father died, so I had access to money that I wouldn't have otherwise had. Now, we've lived in this house now for 11 years, and I've only recently started saying thank you if somebody admires the house. because prior to that, I would feel the need to explain to them that I didn't really deserve the house. I hadn't really earned it. So I always felt quite awkward about it. And I think that's the whole thing. That's what imposter syndrome is. It's this sense of not being worthy enough to be in a certain position, or certainly not to be recognised by others as being deserving of that position or in that position. I think it's something about feeling like a fraud that someone might find out. What are the causes? Well, given it's so common, many of us have it. There are some things about how you grow up, and I do think I have some of those just anecdotally. I think it might be related to my mother's she was quite a critical person, and she would have a tendency to compare any achievements I had with somebody else. So if I got 100% in a test, which was quite rare, obviously, she would say, and I won't shout out because this is one of my best friends, but she would also say, what did this other person get? So it was almost, it wasn't good enough for me to have achieved that in my own right. She wanted the context against the other clever person who would obviously have got better. She would also tell me off for boasting or showing off. Any of you remember that? Being told off not to show off. So I think there is something there where if you've had that upbringing, then it's immodest to be recognised or to be the centre of attention. Other things I know is having a fear of failure, which I also understand that many of us do have. If you're put up on a pedestal, then the distance to fall and the associated humiliation potentially is high. I mean, I must confess, I haven't read the book Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, but I suspect that's what this is all about. So hopefully those aren't just things that I've experienced, and I'm sure they're not. She says, feeling like an imposter. But let's just look a little bit of the history of it. So as I said earlier on, 70% of people, and it's not just women, although I'll come on to the female point in a moment, they have apparently experienced this at some point in their lives. So many of us will have experienced it. And we've talked about earlier where it might stem from. One of the areas also that came up in the research is that if you have a very gifted sibling, so you might have an insecurity complex next to someone who's incredibly bright, or if you were always labelled the clever one, you might have something as well as an imposter syndrome. So some of this you can imagine can be through upbringing, as per my own personal analogy. But officially, it was first coined in 1978 in a book called The Imposter Phenomenon in High Achieving Women by Pauline Clance and Suzanne Innes. So at that point, but remember 1978 was a very different time, it was originally thought to only affect women, and particularly high achievers. Now since then, there's been way more research, and it definitely affects both men and women, although there do seem to be some gender differences. It's defined as the belief that others have an inflated view of your abilities or skills, an intense fear that you're going to be found out as a fake, and it's also someone where you need to attribute successes to factors that are outside of your own skills or talents. So not that you achieved something on your own merits, it's something where it was down to luck or being in the right place at the right time. Now you can see that some of those might be humility. It's about being accepted. So you can see that some of those have benefits. But it's not the key is it's not a mental disorder. It's just a phenomenon that we're going to experience at some point in our life. And going on to more recent research, I came across somewhere more than 1,000 people who had been in work for more than 3 years, so pretty established in the workplace. 85% of them felt inadequate or incompetent at work to some degree. That, I think, is quite a frightening statistic, and it's a reasonably big group. I have, as ever, put the links to where I've got information from at the bottom of the show notes if you want to dig in deeper. In that same study, 39% thought that one day their boss or colleagues would find out that they were underqualified, despite the fact that they'd got extensive experience or qualifications. And also, only 25% of them were aware of imposter syndrome, so they probably really genuinely thought it was real. And I think that's one of the reasons we're doing a podcast on this topic, is actually just flagging this up. If you're feeling unsure and like an imposter, then it's good to know about this. It's good to talk, as they say, because then once you realise it, that's one of the greatest ways of getting over it. So my own quick and dirty poll conducted this weekend, courtesy of the HR Ninjas group, drew more than 40 responses. So it was only a Facebook poll, but thank you very much for those who contributed. It was a predominantly female demographic, and but the results were as follows. So of my, basically, do you feel you experience or you have experienced or experienced imposter complex, it was just whether you don't at all through to experience it a lot. So 66% said that they experienced it a lot, 24% a little. So we've got 90% of the respondents said they absolutely experienced it. Only 7% said not really, and less than 1% said not at all. So really quite high figures. And as I said later, we'll look at what we can do practically about this, because it's fine if it happens to everybody, but we don't want it to hold us back. So just a little bit more on research. As I said earlier, it doesn't just apply to women. In 2018, a team of US and German researchers, they had an article published in the BPS journal. And this basically showed that under pressure, imposter syndrome may actually hit men harder than women, as in they get more anxious and actually may have more of a detrimental effect on their performance. The researchers speculate it might be down to people feeling under traditional gender norms that there was a greater expectation on men to be competent than women. I have to say I take slight issue with that statement, but it is in a journal. I think I would take it down the lines of maybe gender norms don't allow men to admit weakness to the same extent. But anyway, that was the findings. There's also some interesting follow-up studies that you can follow through the links. I won't go into each of them in turn, but they did find that they did a study where they were putting candidates through a sort of a test, an intelligence test, and they stopped them halfway through, or they stopped some of the candidates halfway through and told them that they had got the first 5 questions wrong. And then they monitored the impact on them as they proceeded with the second half of the test. In this example, they found that men had a more extreme reaction and in some cases appeared to self-sabotage in the second half of the test, i.e. make themselves fail, almost so they were in control of the failing. Whereas they found that the women had a less of an impact and continued and almost tried harder in the second half of the test. So interesting again, what that says, it does link into gender norms, and maybe it's more acceptable for women to fail, or they've got lower expectations because they're not expected to achieve in the first place. It's a complex area and I'm not going to go into gender norms further than that. There's definitely room for further research, but thought-provoking, I thought. So we'll summarise by accepting that anyone, in fact most people, are likely to experience imposter syndrome at some point in their careers, and it's probably a really healthy way for us to keep our feet on the ground and have some kind of reality check. Maybe if we don't experience it at all, then that's less usual. Well, obviously it is less usual. To my mind, it's something where we can use it as having a bit of a reality check. And it's always good to have a bit of a reality check to keep our feet on the ground, check we're connected. Now, I mean, I've experienced it a lot over the last few months with what I've done here. Launching the podcast, I had a major internal battle with myself about whether I had anything of value to say. And doing anything like this, you are putting yourself out there and it's really, really feels exposing. But I had to override it because I'd been convinced it was the right thing to do for a range of reasons. And logically, I think, well, everybody has something of value. That's why I have experts on. I don't know everything. Subjects like this, I've had to do lots of research. I'm only telling you what I've investigated. I'm not saying that I'm the expert on imposter phenomenon. I've just done some homework on it and I'm sharing it. But over time, I think doing the podcast, I have become a little bit more confident as you realise that we're all learning together, and that's the point of it. So it's normal, but sometimes it's perhaps not so helpful. So let's think about when might it be normal. If you've had that sense of being an imposter, perhaps let's reflect for a moment and think of the time you last had it. So I last had it when I have been having it recently. I'll tell you that one in a moment. But I had it with the podcast, and that was normal because I was doing something new. So it's really normal to feel like an imposter if you're going into a new role, particularly if you feel that you've been bigged up, like my first example, or labelled as an expert or the clever one, or having special skills, or you've been brought in to solve all the problems of a business that they want you to come in. So you're the new rising star, so you feel a huge amount of pressure. And I speculate this might be to do with our natural fight or flight response, because we're rising our heads up above the parapet, we're making ourselves very visible, and it is natural for us to feel a bit nervous that we might be attacked or struck down. Other places where it's very normal, a change in circumstances. I think it's very common and to be expected when you've got a return to work mum or father, if you go off a decent amount of paternity leave. It's such an extreme life change being a parent. And in fact, you think you also can get an imposter being a new mum or father. So it's an extreme life change, full-time parenting, then go back to work. So it's completely understandable that we might feel a bit like a fish out of water and awkward in those circumstances. entirely normal, entirely to be expected, but we have got all of those skills still to draw on, and it's about being logical and also being kind to ourselves. I think it's quite usual to feel like an imposter if you join a new group or a clique where you don't know their skills, so they might be amazing at stuff and they don't know your skills. So you don't have a context of the people that you're in front of. And you've got to sound it out first before you do it. And depending on your sense, okay, some people might jump in and think they're the expert, which actually can lead to them being shot down. If you go in and actually act with a little bit of humility, that is probably a better way of entering a group. That doesn't mean you have to feel like an imposter, but having humility is a sensible way forwards, and identifying where you've got value to add and feeling confidence that you will still have value to add in that group. Doing anything different, I think that's normal to feel like an imposter. So people who are challenging stereotypes or gender norms, this whole gender piece. So people who are doing things, it seems to be some evidence, sorry to return to the gender thing, about females in entrepreneurship experiencing it. But I can imagine there might well be, if you're a bloke going to work in a school or a nursery where you're outnumbered, may feel more likely and more anxious to have it. And again, why should you have any less skills than the next person going into those roles on either side? And it's normal to feel like an imposter if you feel like you're being put into the position of an expert. You're delivering a training course, you've been asked to be a speaker, to write something. Normal to feel like that. You've been put in that position of an expert, and perhaps it's just about being experienced enough to think, well, actually, where do I have expertise? And thinking about that logically as to why people invited you to do that in the first place. They clearly saw value. So an observation that I've made while researching this is that we can't actually grow without moving out of our comfort zone. That's a whole piece really for us to stretch ourselves to do something different. However, as soon as you try and stretch yourself and do something different, it feels a bit uncomfortable. And I think that's when we're going to be quite likely to feel imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. And I think it's probably about a self-protection mechanism, which is there to try and keep us safe. And that's all well and good. The problem is if it holds us back. So if you think that imposter syndrome might be holding you back, you might be experiencing some of the following syndromes. You may be spending quite a lot of time worrying that you're not living up to expectations. Sometimes people, where they're being held back, they might not say yes to new or extra responsibilities, not because they don't feel they can do them or they're lazy, but because they're worried it's going to compromise the quality of other things they're doing. There's a real link to perfectionism here. There's this term called the imposter cycle. It's almost like every time you achieve something, you become more worried about getting found out. So you really, if people are going like that, if you feel that this is going on in a cyclical and growing way, then that's going to be holding you back. And you do want to look to get some help with something like that, if you feel it's building, as opposed to being a one-off in response to one of the situations I said earlier, where it's normal to feel like an imposter. Do you genuinely believe your success is down to outside factors? You know, you've got the job because you were lucky, or no one applied on that thing. Is that genuinely what you believe? Or do you believe that actually maybe luck played a part of it, but 80% of it was down to your skills, your performance at interview, etc., etc. So drilling beneath what you might say on the surface to be modest and thinking, do I really think this was not down to me? And if you genuinely believe that, then it might be holding you back. And the other one is if you find you self-sabotage. Have you ever found yourself undermining yourself or your own efforts in order to be able to explain failure because you controlled it rather than risking trying hard to succeed and still failing? That's a classic fear of failure attribute, and certainly I've experienced that myself. A lady called Dr. Valerie Young, who is considered to be an expert on this syndrome, has identified 5 types of imposters, and we've done a little infographic on this for you that you can download if you want to from the show notes to summarise this, and also how we can help ourselves. So feel free to go and get those later if you want. But in short, the 5 types are the expert, the perfectionist, the natural genius, the soloist, and the superhero. So taking each one in turn, the expert is someone who is an expert, but the key is it links to perfectionism really, because they don't feel satisfied that they've finished the task until they know everything. And of course, you never know everything. So they might not feel that they can apply for a job because they don't have every requirement to be that category of the expert. Similar to the expert, but the perfectionist, this is where people actually get quite anxious if they fail to achieve their extreme goals. So they set very high demanding goals and they're dissatisfied with their work. They focus on failings or things that could have been done better rather than the positives and the achievements. Natural geniuses, this is an interesting one, but this kind of links maybe to upbringing, where you've got people who are really used to achieving, but therefore, if they don't find things easy, they're so used to having gone through life and finding everything easy, let's say they were very bright or whatever at school, they then feel quite nervous and weak if they're not successful. So it's almost like they don't feel it's safe not to be amazing at everything. So I'm so glad I'm not a natural genius. The soloist, this is someone who is an individual. So they're quite individualistic. They prefer to work alone. And I think it's almost like linked, if anyone's ever done drivers, the Be Strong driver, they don't want to ask for help because they feel if they do that, it will give away the fact that they don't know everything. So they feel it's all about doing it all themselves. And then finally, the superhero, it's the workaholic. The person excels in all areas. They push themselves so hard. The problem is they may result in burnout, just very, very high achievers and continually raising their expectations and never pleased or positive about what they've achieved. So those are sort of 5 categories that Dr. Valerie Young came up with. I'd say they're quite stereotypical, but again, do you see a little bit of yourself in any one of these, or do you recognise others in these? And all of these are quite extremes, where this would be someone living that way for the entirety of their life, as opposed to experiencing it on a regular basis. So I would say if people are struggling with that, that might be an example where someone should go and see an expert and look at something like cognitive behavioural therapy, because it could be holding them back. For the rest of us, in a normal scenario where you're just experiencing it here and there, I've got 4 tips that we can do to help ourselves and others who might be experiencing imposter syndrome. So the first one is normalise it. So that means talk about it. So like I was saying, okay, I'm feeling a bit of imposter syndrome because whatever, and actually make lighthearted, and it's normal to feel that way. And hopefully other people make it safe for you as well and support you, or vice versa. You can support others. So, we might say something, well, we've all had to start somewhere, or, actually your experience is just as valid as the next person. Or we might flip that and ask that in a coaching question, depending on whether you want that person to, how does your experience stack up against your listeners if you're doing a podcast? So normalise it and encourage people to express it, which sort of lets it go. It takes away the power, gets rid of the feeling. The next one is recognise achievements and successes. And I think those of us in HR roles, particularly in-house, we can really help with this as part of getting managers to do that, making sure that we are consistently and objectively giving feedback and recognition. And I'm not talking about general well done. This is about the ability to give good quality feedback, and good quality feedback is specific. And it's not just negative feedback, it's making sure that when someone does something well, we explain exactly what they did well. They researched something brilliantly, they presented, giving them specifics about what it was they did and said well, and ideally getting them to feel that positive. But they're more likely to feel it if they don't feel it is subjective. So we have to give examples of what it was that was done well. The third one I believe is important is to encourage people to carry out well thought through risks. So support people to step out of their comfort zone. Applaud the effort and risk, whatever the result, because people are trying to grow. It's about focusing on what can be learned and discouraging perfectionism. Going for 80 or 90% is brilliant if we're going in the right direction. So helping people to make it safe to not get it perfectly 100% right every time. The important thing is learning and making progress. And the final one is, if you do hear people expressing imposter thoughts, it's kind of challenging that reality of it. It's a kind of unhealthy thinking pattern, really. So what's the reality? So, where are they getting that thought from? What is their evidence for that negative thought? Are there examples where others have been in similar positions, took risks and succeeded? What's the worst that can happen? So actually helping people and teaching people to challenge imposter thoughts themselves. So those are my 4 takeaways, if you like, in terms of helping others or ourselves. Talk about it, i.e. normalise it. Recognise, get into the habit of good quality, specific recognition of achievements and get the people that you work with to do the same. Create an environment where it's comfortable to take well thought through risks. and directly challenge those imposter thoughts, as in, where's the evidence for them? Help people to realise that they're not actually grounded in fact. So we're pretty much there. I hope you found that reasonably interesting. I think one of the takeaways that I would say is people who don't have imposter syndrome are no more capable than people who do have imposter syndrome. They just think different thoughts. And when you put it like that, you realise I really shouldn't allow my thoughts to stop me from doing things or achieving things that I want to achieve, because I am as good as the next person, or I may be as good as the next person, particularly if it's just my thoughts that are holding me back. So that's it for this week. And fittingly, I'm going to challenge myself to talk about 2 pilot programs that are launching in March and April. Now, I've been thinking about running these programs since November, and it was only when I was writing this episode that I realised that good old imposter syndrome was making me procrastinate on telling people about them, on launching them. And again, it's that kind of fear of failure, isn't it? It's putting yourself out there. So we have, in response to feedback from a number of people who've asked about things, so we believe that there is a need for these 2 programs, and obviously I'm going to find out soon enough. We're going to run 2 HR Uprising programs. One is an 8-week HR mentoring mastermind. If you've never heard of a mentoring mastermind, this is where you bring together a cohort of like-minded people. And what we'll be doing is we'll be doing it virtually, so it doesn't matter where you live, and it'll be for 75 minutes each week. It'll be really focused, and we'll do some training input on a specific topic, and then we'll do individual challenges and networking, so focused collaboration, where we get someone to bring a challenge to the table and in a structured way help them to resolve it. The idea then is you will build a group of people who actually are in a position, hopefully, I'll aim as possible, where possible, to make them peers, where they can support each other, and those relationships may well go on for longer than the 8-week programme. And the second one is I'm going to run some 1-day training courses on how to be a change superhero. And the first one of those is on the 2nd of April. I didn't mention previously, the 8-week mentoring mastermind is likely to kick off on the 27th of March. So literally, we're about to launch it. By the time this goes out, it should have been launched the week before. If you are interested in knowing more about these, please just visit the show notes. It's easy to remember, hruprising.com. That will take you to the page on our Actus page, which is where we have all our resources and our courses. And you can find out more information there. There is an HR Uprising discount code. I'm going to put it on the HR Uprising show page, because once the course is full, we may have to move it to a future date. And obviously this podcast is fixed once I send it out. Back to the actual content of the programme, there's quite a few references. I think 4 or 5 references that I alluded to here. If you want to go and dig deeper into imposter syndrome, those references are also in the show notes. Finally, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy what we're doing, please tell your friends and colleagues. And until next week, remember, we're here to learn together, collaborate together, and rise up together. Until next week, goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast. You can access more information, including resources or links mentioned in the show, at our website, www.hruprising.com. Also, you might want to join our LinkedIn community or tweet to us at HR Uprising. We'd love to hear from you.